Welcome back to Lost Test Channel. My name is Anton Vieltsin. I'm an attorney in the Southern District of California here in San Diego. I'm actually licensed in Nevada, California, and I take cases throughout the West Coast. Today we're going to discuss a case where a motorcyclist gets pulled over for speeding and driving recklessly. The officer repeatedly tells him that he's not under arrest, but then he still handcuffs this person and then threatens him that he will search the rider's backpack. In response, the rider tells the officer that he's felon in possession because he has a gun in his backpack. Now that search would have been in violation of the Fourth Amendment. In fact, in this video and this podcast, we will go in detail discussing the Fourth Amendment and some of the exceptions to the warrant requirement that have been articulated by the Supreme Court. But before we do so, I want to thank you for joining me on YouTube and finding my podcast on Spotify and Audible. Please give my YouTube channel a thumbs up and subscribe. And on Spotify, give the podcast a 5-star review rating. So let's go ahead and discuss this case.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
Lost Law Firm
at Western Region, San Diego. To accept this call, press 5. To refuse this call, hang up now. Thank you for using T-Netics. You may start the conversation now.
Today we're discussing United States v. Howard, which is a United States District Court case from the Northern District of California. Mr. Howard got pulled over by the California Highway Patrol for speeding and riding recklessly. The officer got Mr. Howard's identification and then began to inquire whether Mr. Howard was driving under the influence. So he conducted a field sobriety test by asking Mr. Howard to follow the officer's finger with his eyes. At that point, he made a decision to have a probable cause search of Mr. Howard and his backpack. He asked Mr. Howard to get off the motorcycle, place his backpack on the ground, and at that point the officer handcuffed Mr. Howard. But he told him that this individual was not under arrest. He then inquired further whether Mr. Howard was using marijuana. Mr. Howard replied that he had an e-cigarette in his backpack. The officer then talked more and asked more questions about marijuana usage, at which point Mr. Howard said whether he needs a lawyer, and he asked for one. Now, the officer again replied, telling Mr. Howard that he's not under arrest and that he doesn't need a lawyer to be standing there on the side of the road with him. The officer then told Mr. Howard that he will search the backpack under what he called probable cause search exception to the warrant requirement. At which point, Mr. Howard simply told the officer that there is no point in searching the backpack. He revealed that he was a felon and that he had a firearm in that backpack. With that information in hand, the officer opened the backpack, found the gun, and arrested Mr. Howard for being felon in possession. And so he's now looking at these federal charges. Now remember, the Fourth Amendment protects you against unreasonable searches and seizures, which means that officers, generally speaking, need to have a warrant before they can search or seize you. In this case, the officer relied on what he called probable cause exception, but there is no such exception under federal or state law. In fact, the Supreme Court has enumerated a number of exceptions. I went over all of them in one of my series that I've published here on YouTube and on my podcast. These exceptions include search incident to arrest, consent, automobile exception, inventory searches, and so on. But probable cause in itself is not an exception. In fact, the court reminds us that probable cause is not itself an exception to the warrant requirement, even if an officer has probable cause to believe that a bag or a box or a house contains evidence of criminal activity, he must get a warrant before searching it, unless one of the actual exceptions to the warrant requirement applies. The only other exception to the warrant requirement the government can assert here is search incident to arrest. And remember, under search incident to arrest, the officer needs to be arresting an individual, and he can search immediate areas in control of that individual if he believes that his safety is a concern or that evidence can be destroyed. In this situation, the officer repeatedly told Mr. Howard that he was not being arrested. And if the opposite was true, if in fact Mr. Howard was in the process of being arrested, well, in that situation, how come the officer never gave Mr. Howard his Miranda rights? Remember, under Miranda, an individual needs to receive his rights if he's in custody and being interrogated. Of course, in this situation, if he's in custody and being arrested, then Miranda would apply. But the officer never gave Miranda, because after all, the officer repeatedly told Mr. Howard that he's not under arrest. So search incident to arrest doesn't apply, because in fact, there was no arrest in this situation. Until later on, when the officer found that firearm in the backpack. But we know that officers cannot rely on information that they received under threat. We need to look at what the officer knew at the time of the search. And at the time of the search, prior to it, he didn't know that there would be firearm there. The only reason that confession came around is because of the threat that he would violate Mr. Howard's Fourth Amendment and search the backpack. Finally, we know with other exceptions, officers can never use an excuse to violate the Fourth Amendment. They can't create their own exigency and then rely on exigent circumstances. They can't rely on search incident to arrest if there is no arrest. I hope you now understand a little bit more about these exceptions. In this case, the confession itself and the firearm must be suppressed, meaning it cannot be used against Mr. Howard in court, and chances are this case would fall apart and be dismissed against Mr. Howard. I ask you now to click like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button so next time I post, you'll be first to know. And if you're listening to a podcast form on Spotify or Audible, give my podcast a 5-star review rating. Thanks for watching.